Okay, so today we are doing the final step in the writing process, which is creating our conclusion. So, first things first, what is a conclusion? The conclusion of a research paper specifically is where you wrap up your ideas and leave the reader with a strong final impression of your overall research. It has several key goals. First thing you want to do is restate the thesis that's been addressed in the entire paper so far. Then summarize your overall arguments or findings. In this case, that's going to be, kind of pulling out what impact the activist that you've been researching has had on the world as a whole, and then suggest key takeaways from your paper. In this case, we're going to call that your own discussion of the impact or the impact that the activist left. So the first thing you're going to do is restate your thesis. Now, here you want to remind the reader what argument you are making or the thesis that you're supporting through your entire paper. So just to remind you that you have been supporting this through your entire paper. If you look back at your topic sentences that start each of your body paragraphs, those should all tie back together into the thesis and make that point. While it is important to restate your thesis, you do want to make sure that you don't use the exact same wording to introduce the paragraph. Instead, you want to rephrase it. Remember, the reader knows more at the end of your paper than they did at the beginning, so they can understand it a little bit better. If you're struggling with this, take a look at the hint down at the bottom. Read it once. So go back to your introduction paragraph. Your thesis should be the last sentence of that introduction paragraph. Read it, then look away from it. Either close out the screen, turn and look away, and then explain it to somebody or pretend to explain it to somebody just from memory. Then use the wording that you said to explain it to help to write your restated thesis. Now, if you're just like looking at the screen, reading it, and then looking away and then restating it, that's not helpful. Close it, step back for a second, and then try to explain it other than just saying that first sentence. Once you've restated it, you'll probably show your more thorough understanding of the thesis, and so the reader will understand it a little bit better when you introduce it for your conclusion that way as well. Next thing I want to touch on, especially because this is one of your first research papers that you've done in high school. Especially in middle school, you probably use transition words or phrases to write a conclusion. Things like in conclusion, to conclude, to summarize, finally. You want to get away from those sorts of phrases, especially in higher level academic papers. They sound unsophisticated. To somebody who's reading this, they can tell it's a little jagged, right? Like it's a very clear transition word, like, oh, okay, we're reading the thesis now or the conclusion now. You don't want to jar them like that. You want it to flow smoothly. So instead, just restate the thesis in an interesting way and dive right into the content. In this case, you don't need that transition word because your thesis should seamlessly transition from the previous paragraph without too much trouble here. So here's a thesis example. If I was writing about the activist Louis Braille or just about Braille in general, my thesis would read, before the invention of Braille, blind people were unable to get by in the world without depending on the support of others to help them with any tasks that involved reading or writing. But because of Louis Braille, they were able to take on a wider variety of jobs, attend schools and universities, and feel more independent in a primarily sighted society. Note, this is a rather in detail thesis. So if you are looking at your thesis in the introduction and it's one sentence long, to restate it and write it, mine is 4 lines long. If yours looks more like this by the end, that's a good way to be. That means that you've elaborated on it and you understand it better, and so can the reader. Then after you've written your thesis in your conclusion, you want to kind of sum up what you've already written about in the other paragraphs. Again, don't revert back to your middle school writing. Don't just say, first they did this, then they did this, finally they did this. That's juvenile. We're beyond that at this point. So in the body of your conclusion paper, we're going to review how the actions of the person or group you're researching had a lasting impact on the world. You've probably addressed this in some form within your body paragraphs, but you haven't necessarily analyzed it or put it together how one part, maybe from their childhood, could connect to their later career. So, some examples that you might bring up are schools still teaching about this person. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. We still see schools teach about him. We have a holiday for him. There's a statue of him in Washington, D.C. You could talk about inspiring other activists through their actions. So, again, using Martin Luther King as our example, many people have cited Martin Luther King Jr. as the inspiration for them to begin their activism. You would need to find some examples of that. And actually, in this case, it is perfectly fine to cite somebody for an example in this conclusion paragraph. That's not always the case. Usually you try to avoid adding new information in your conclusion, but here, because we are doing a little bit of analysis as part of our conclusion, it is acceptable. If they wrote any books or speeches that are still currently read, I know several of you are doing Frederick Douglass. His speeches are primarily read in, like, I literally just read a Frederick Douglass speech in one of my graduate classes this year. You could talk about many of them have inspired changes in policies, laws, or the cultural acceptance of certain groups. So, for example, if they were involved in any court cases, if they forced a city or a school to allow people of color to mix with white people in a school, that would be a lasting change, to be the first to really do that, or the first to normalize that sort of thing. Or if they created a group, a college, an organization, a library, a research institution, or anything else that is still currently used, or if it was used after their death, even if it's not still being currently used, that can still be considered an important lasting impact. You can also probably come up with some things that I haven't even begun to touch on here, and that is absolutely fine. These are just some examples that might help a lot of you. So, for my example of a recap, because of Louis Braille's creative approach to communication, there are now 85 different dialects of the Braille language currently used around the world. Then again, you can see I'm citing the Library of Congress, 2009. Society has also embraced the learning needs of the blind community, and in the United States alone, there are 50 schools for the blind, nearly one in every state. So here, I've already talked about in my essay the creation of Braille, how it was implemented, how it has impacted people. And so I would just reference that stuff by stating, here's how it is useful. Here's how it has impacted a lasting change. I don't need to go into that detail because I've already explained that in the body paragraphs. I'm just summarizing and reminding the reader of how those things that I've already talked about are going to have a positive impact on people who are blind in the present day. Then here is one of the trickier parts of writing your conclusion. So after you discuss the lasting impact, after you state the lasting impact, you need to discuss it. So what take are you bringing to this research? You've looked into this. How is this useful? What impact do you see? How do you see this as useful or worthwhile? So, some examples. You could discuss how the world would have been worse off with this person, how long things like unsegregated schools, slavery, or civil rights would have taken without this person's influence. Or another way that you could look at that is groups that may not have been as interested in taking action with those sorts of movements without this person. So, for example, I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass right now. He spoke to a lot of women's groups, so white women's groups that were big on abolition of slavery. He brought them into that discussion because of his speeches. So think about how much impact they had on that movement and how long it would have taken them, if at all, to get involved with that movement without Frederick Douglass. How society now views people that this person or group fought for before and after their activism. So you can think about things like LGBTQIA rights. What did society think of them before and after certain activists? What about, women in schools? There are some activists who had to fight to get schools for women. The idea of seeing Black people or people of color as less than white people. What did your activists do to change the view of society to understand that concept better, that they are actually equal? And that being said, there are tons of other outlooks based on what you found that can be important and worth discussing. So if you have a take, that means you've read and engaged with this well enough that you've started to form your own thoughts and opinions on it. This is the place for that. One key thing though, even though it's your opinion, do not use I, me, we, you, your, our. Keep yourself and the reader out of this discussion. State everything as fact. So here's my discussion example. And keep in mind, you won't see any examples of I or you words in my example here. So earning and maintaining rights for disabled people is still an issue that needs further support in the United States. After Louis Braille, the next predominant activist for blind people would not step up for another 35 years. Without the creation of the Braille Code, there is a chance that blind Americans would still be treated as outcasts to society, as the American society has been slow to change and accept them as equals to the rest of sighted citizens. Now, this is not a very well cited example. I just put this together to show you how you could phrase this. So feel free to use this as your example, but you'll notice everything that I said was stated as a statement of fact here. I don't say I think or I will. Keep that stuff out of here. And then for your own example, I went ahead and at the end of the slide, I've put all three of these parts together. So I color coded them to make it a little bit easier. You can see in the blue, I've got the restatement of my thesis. Green is summing it up, and then red is the discussion. So once you have those three parts, put those together, and that goes at the very end of your research paper.